Hey everyone, welcome to Toast and Topics. We have an exciting episode coming your way today on nuclear energy. But before getting into that, we have something to celebrate. We're just at the point of our 1 year anniversary of doing Toast and Topics, with our first episode having been recorded on July 4th of last year. Sachin, happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary, Ben. I really can't believe that a whole year has gone by since we recorded our very first episode. In this time span, we've recorded 23 episodes, expanded from just being on Spotify to now on all major podcasting platforms, as well as YouTube. And we've gotten over 20,000 impressions and downloads on various social media. So I'm really proud of what we've been able to do so far.
It's great, and I expect that there is more growth to come. So, to our audience, we hope you're still liking and learning from all the content that we've been producing. And if you are, please keep on sharing Toast and Topics with others.
And on that note, I'm also happy to announce to our audience that we've actually designed some fresh new Toast and Topics t-shirts. We will advertise this product on our social media platforms. And if you like what you see, we'd love for you to fill out an interest form to order one for yourself. We currently have a very limited number in stock, just 10 in fact, as a first pass through. But with that said, we are working on a raffle to give away some of our first t-shirts to some of our biggest fans. So stay tuned for more details there.
I can confirm that these t-shirts are of great quality and they look cool too. So, with all that said, let's get into our topic for today. Nuclear energy has been used by the United States and other countries since the 1950s, but its popularity has ebbed and flowed with concerns over the safety and effectiveness of the technology. Recently, however, there has been a set of exciting developments related to nuclear energy in the United States. The first is that the nuclear power startup TerraPower has been at work developing a new kind of nuclear reactor, which we'll discuss more at the end of this podcast, in the Wyoming town of Kemmerer. The company has 4 billion in backing from Microsoft founder Bill Gates and the US Department of Energy. Second, just a couple weeks ago on June 20th, 2024, Congress passed the ADVANCE Act. This bill is a significant action by Congress to make it easier and faster to permit and build new nuclear reactors. Third, the past 2 years have seen breakthroughs in the development of nuclear fusion energy. At the end of 2022, scientists were able to achieve a net energy gain in a nuclear fusion experiment, which is a first for this field. So, with all these exciting new developments, it's worth taking a closer look at the nuclear power industry worldwide. So, to start off, let's get into how nuclear power actually works. Sachin?
Yeah, now you're really testing my knowledge here. This goes way back to my high school chemistry class, but I used to be pretty good at it back in the day, so let me give it a try. So, nuclear energy is produced by releasing energy in atoms. All atoms have a nucleus with protons and neutrons, and the energy that holds this nucleus together is enormous, and it can be released when these strong bonds are broken. There are two primary methods to generate nuclear power, and those are called fission and fusion. Fission splits a heavy element into fragments, while fusion actually joins two lighter elements. And in both cases, energy is freed because the mass of the remaining nucleus is smaller than the mass of whatever's being reacted. Um, and currently, all operational nuclear power plants around the world use nuclear fission to generate electricity. Fusion is not yet a commercially viable source of energy, but as you said, Ben, there have been some recent advancements surrounding the technology, and a prototype fusion reactor may be built over the coming decades.
That's interesting, Sachin. So, what parts of the world are most reliant on nuclear power today?
It's a good question. Nuclear power currently generates about 10% of the world's electricity, and that's actually a decline from about 15% in the 1980s. But reliance on nuclear power really varies significantly by country. For example, in the early 2000s, France generated some 80% of its electricity from nuclear power, though that share has leveled off to about 65% today. The US and Russia both generate about 18% of their power from nuclear. And Ukraine, the country home to the infamous power plant Chernobyl, generates about 50% of its power still from nuclear energy. There are many countries with no nuclear power whatsoever as well. Italy is one example, which shut down its last two nuclear power plants after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. And other countries like Germany have noticeably curtailed their use of nuclear energy over the past decade.
As our audience probably knows, there is a whole debate around the merits of using nuclear power. Public opinion has swayed in both directions over the years here, so it's worth going back to understand the context behind this all a bit more. In 1953, 8 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II by nuclear weapons, President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his Atoms for Peace speech advocating for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And by 1954, the US had begun to firmly concentrate on promoting peaceful nuclear applications, which led to a United Nations sponsored international conference on nuclear power. And that created the impetus for the US utilities industry to order more than 50 nuclear reactors to meet the country's growing energy demands. American leaders had high hopes about this. They actually, at one point, predicted that upwards of 1,000 nuclear plants could be constructed in the country by the year 2000. But these hopes turned out to be short lived as more widespread anti nuclear lobbying movements began to gain clout during the 1960s. By April of 1976, Gallup reported that 60% of Americans opposed the construction of more nuclear plants. And a lot of this wasn't really an objection to, the technology itself or how it was generating energy, but instead due to skepticism over the safety of these plants. So over time, opinions about nuclear power have wavered. In 2010, 60% of Americans were in favor of increasing the use of nuclear energy, which was the highest level of support seen for it in years. But in 2012, a year after the well-known Fukushima nuclear plant disaster in Japan, support in the United States for nuclear energy had dipped to 57%.
That's interesting. It sounds like, on balance, the majority of Americans do support nuclear power. And I would imagine that this is highly correlated to increases in oil and gas prices, which would prompt people to think more about alternative sources of energy.
Yeah, that could be the case. And as I recall, during that period, gas prices were especially high. And so I think this is a good moment to get into some of the key points surrounding the debate about nuclear power. Sachin, do you want to dive into that first?
Yeah, so as you said, nuclear power is currently undergoing somewhat of a renaissance in the US, with a growing number of leading environmentalists and political figures from both sides of the aisle supporting the energy source as a potential alternative to fossil fuels. And I think that the climate change angle is perhaps the biggest reason to be considering expanding investments in nuclear energy. Just for context here, the electricity and heat sector is the largest source of human-made CO2 emissions. In 2019, 63% of the world's electricity was generated from the burning of fossil fuels, which is virtually unchanged from 1999. And over the same period, the absolute production of electricity from fossil fuels increased by 80%. So it remains hugely skewed towards carbon intensive processes. So therefore, it's also the sector with the greatest opportunity to be decarbonized. In fact, the whole life cycle CO2 emissions associated with nuclear energy are among the lowest of all forms of electricity generation, at similar levels to onshore wind. The second argument for moving over towards nuclear energy is that it's a reliable, stable, and long-term source of power. Nuclear power plants can operate for decades. For example, in the US, reactors have been licensed to operate for nearly 80 years, and during which the operational costs are generally low. Uh, Solar and wind, on the other hand, are more intermittent sources of electricity that require backup. And as an obvious example, if the sun were behind the clouds for an entire week, relying on just solar energy would be a potential vulnerability. So nuclear power plants provide a steady and reliable source of electricity, and that sets it apart from some other renewable power sources. And then finally is that nuclear energy has incredibly high energy density. And it's much higher compared to fossil fuels and other renewable sources. In other words, a small amount of nuclear fuel can produce a very large amount of energy, which makes it incredibly efficient. And just to put some numbers behind this, to generate the same amount of energy as 1 kilogram of uranium 235, about 1.8 million kilograms or 1,800 tons of oil would be needed, and nearly 1,500 tons of coal. The energy density of renewable sources like solar and wind is harder to quantify in the same terms as they depend on different factors like location and weather conditions. But it's fair to say that their energy output per unit of area is significantly lower than that of nuclear power plants.
Those are pretty compelling points there. In fact, you're almost selling me on this whole nuclear power idea, Sachin. But I think there are also some important points to consider here that have been made against moving toward building more nuclear power plants over the years. And all of these, I think, are pretty relevant. One is just the economics of it all, and particularly the high upfront costs and time to build nuclear power plants. These are some of the most expensive infrastructure projects ever undertaken, with direct costs such as materials, equipment, labor, and then indirect costs such as engineering services, construction management, and administrative overhead totaling between 15 to $30 billion for an individual nuclear power plant. Just for context here, it costs around $12 billion to build an aircraft carrier. So these things are really massively expensive. One nuclear power plant also takes on average about 14 and a half years to build from the planning phase all the way to its operation. On the other hand, utility scale wind and solar farms take on average only 2 to 5 years from the planning phase to operation. And in fact, large scale rooftop solar panel projects really are now down to only a 6 month timeline. And so, just when factoring in the cost of setting up a nuclear power plant, the levelized cost of energy here of the total annualized cost for a nuclear power plant is about $151 per megawatt hour. And that compares to $43 per megawatt hour for onshore wind and $41 per megawatt hour for utility scale solar. So, in other words, there's actually a pretty big cost problem with nuclear power plants. It's a more expensive energy source than some of these other renewables, just due to the cost of setting them up. The next point here is safety concerns. Serious nuclear accidents are very, very rare, but when they happen, they can be deadly and immensely costly to clean up. The April 1986 Chernobyl accident in Ukraine is one example of this, as well as the Fukushima meltdown in 2011. Many of those who survived here were left with permanent health effects from exposure to nuclear radiation. Moreover, the waste from nuclear power plants is quite deadly. Consumed fuel rods contain radioactive waste, and the sites that store this waste need to be maintained and funded for up to 200,000 years to allow these materials to fully decompose. And the more nuclear waste that accumulates, the greater the risk is of radioactive leaks, which can damage water supplies, crops, animals, and of course, humans. So, with all that being said, there are some reasons to be hesitant about fully embracing nuclear power as an energy source.
200,000 years is a really long time. So I did not know it took that long. And this is all really interesting. So, have there been efforts to make these sources of energy cheaper to build and safer to operate?
Yeah, look no further than the work that TerraPower has undertaken in Wyoming, which I mentioned at the start of this episode. TerraPower is working on building traditional fission reactors, but they have an interesting twist. Nuclear reactions generate significant amounts of heat, And in most nuclear plants, water absorbs that heat, then boils into steam, and then that steam turns turbines that generate electricity. Water is also used as a coolant for the nuclear reactor's fuel. The Nuclear Energy Institute estimates that a nuclear power plant can consume billions of gallons of water per year, and that water is often contaminated with radiation, which means that it needs to go through significant filtration before being released or reused. And it also costs a lot of money to build plants that can contain the pressure from all of that steam that's being generated by them. So instead of using water to generate heat, TerraPower aims to instead use liquid metal, namely the element natrium, which is to say salt. And that has two advantages. The first is that it reduces the amount of water that needs to be used in the plant, which cuts waste. And the second is that natrium boils at a much higher temperature than water does. So, in other words, it's not flowing through the plant as a gas like steam would be. It's actually just going through the plant as a liquid. And so it doesn't need to be pressurized in the same way. As a result of that, the plants that TerraPower proposes building are smaller since they don't need to contain all of that pressure. TerraPower claims that these plants require half the concrete, steel, and on site labor to complete as compared to traditional nuclear power plants. And so this innovation is fascinating, and it's going to be interesting to see how TerraPower's efforts to build a plant of this kind in Wyoming progress.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like it addresses both the cost and the safety angle of nuclear energy. So it sounds like only time will tell if these advances can potentially reverse some of the stagnation in nuclear energy that we've seen over the course of the past few decades. So just to conclude here, ultimately, it seems to me that all forms of low carbon electricity generation must grow significantly if the world is to control greenhouse gas emissions and achieve the targets that they've set over the next few decades. And the burning question for our leaders is how can we stop burning fossil fuels to meet our climate goals while ensuring that the power grid still remains reliable. And while there are some concerns over the safety of nuclear power that remain to be sorted out, it seems to me that it could be a very important answer to this important question.
As you said, Sachin, only time will tell here, but there certainly is a lot of potential in nuclear energy. Thanks for the great conversation. I learned a lot. And on that note, next week we will be joined by Ellie Murphy, a longtime friend of Sachin's, who recently returned to the United States after nearly 2 years in Rwanda teaching young Afghan girls. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating conversation.
I promise it will be. Thanks, guys. We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.